Okay, here we are, Logic Lesson 3, Validity and Counterarguments. In this lesson, we are going to try to get a really solid handle on the concept of validity, and we're going to learn how to use counterarguments to demonstrate that an argument is invalid. But before we get to that, a little bit of review. Do you remember the term that we used in logic for good arguments? Good arguments are sound. Sound arguments. Sound arguments have two main features. They have all true premises, and they are valid. Remember that valid is not the same thing as true. Again, I know that may be the way we use the word in everyday usage, but when we are doing logic, valid does not equal true. Statements are true or false. Only reasoning, inferences, and arguments are valid or invalid. And again, we'll be going more in detail about validity later in the lesson. So let's talk right now about truth. To evaluate when a statement is true, we want to keep in mind that we can break statements down into basically two different categories. Two different kinds of claims or statements. The first category of statement would be empirical statements or empirical claims. These are the sorts of claims which would be supported by observation, experience, experiment. They can be refuted or supported by observation, experience, or experiment. We should accept empirical statements as true when they have sufficient support from observation, experience, experiment. Non-empirical statements are a little trickier. These statements or claims cannot be fully refuted or completely supported using observation, experiment, or experience. So we have to think of other ways for evaluating non-empirical claims. So, to think about how to evaluate non-empirical claims, let's keep in mind that there are different kinds of non-empirical claims, four important kinds of non-empirical claims we talked about: definitions and axioms. Definitions and axioms make good basic premises, though we should keep in mind Socrates' lesson to Euthyphro that we also want to make sure the definitions make sense before we use them as basic premises. But if we've accepted a definition as a solid, good definition of a term, it has the correct form, it's a logical definition, then it's going to make a good basic premise for an argument for a non-empirical claim. Axioms are, by definition, the sorts of statements that we understand to be so self-evidently true as to not need further evidence. So again, they make good basic premises. Analytic claims are claims that are derived from analyzing the concepts of the terms involved. So our example from last time was that all effects have causes. If we analyze the concept of an effect, it follows that every effect has a cause. Again, analytic claims, being true by definition, make good basic premises. Metaphysical claims are claims about the nature of reality, about the kinds of things that do or do not exist in reality, gods, souls, free will, objective moral standards. Metaphysical claims do not generally make good basic premises. Metaphysical claims are the sorts of claims that need to be argued for using analytic claims, definitions, and axioms as basic premises. Empirical claims can sometimes be used as indirect evidence for or against a metaphysical claim, but a metaphysical claim cannot be completely refuted or supported using only empirical claims. Fourth type of non-empirical claim, value claims. These can be aesthetic claims about beauty and other artistic qualities, or ethical claims about moral qualities, qualities of right, wrong, good, evil, etc. Value claims can sometimes, in certain contexts, be appropriate basic premises, but they're more like metaphysical claims. You need to argue for them using definitions and analytic claims and so forth. Okay, that's it for the review. Let's move on to discuss in greater detail the concept of validity. So, arguments are valid when the premises logically imply the conclusion, or the conclusion follows logically from the premises. Those are two ways of saying the same thing. Arguments are valid when the premises imply the conclusion, or the conclusion follows logically from the premises. But how do we know? How do we know when the premises imply the conclusion? How do we know that the conclusion follows logically from the premises? In order to figure that out, we need a more precise definition of validity. A more precise definition of validity is going to tell us how we can figure out when the premises imply the conclusion, when the conclusion follows from the premises. So, and before I give you this more precise definition of validity, I want to stop here and emphasize the very importance of this definition of validity. You need to understand this definition of validity fully, because it is going to be the foundation of every other thing that you learn in logic. You're going to need to understand it to do every other assignment in the class, and it's important that you understand it and not just memorize it. You have to understand how it works. So, if at the end of this lesson you really still do not fully understand the concept of validity, that's okay, but make sure that you come to class with questions so that by the end of class you've got a solid grasp of this concept and of this definition. It is so important for the rest of the class, for the rest of the semester. Okay, so here we go. An argument is valid when, if all the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. Now, look at the way I phrased this. It's valid when, if all the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. I'm not saying that all of the premises have to be true. And this is an important point. An argument can be valid even if some or all of the premises are false. Do you think you can explain why? Why is it that an argument could be valid but not sound, even if some or all of the premises were false? I'll explain it this way. Validity has to do with the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. Are the premises connected to the conclusion in such a way that the conclusion follows logically from them? So validity has to do with the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion, so that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. So, here's a strategy, a way of trying to decide when the argument is valid. First, suppose or temporarily assume the premises are true. You don't have to believe them forever, but just when trying to determine validity, suppose or temporarily assume for the moment that the premises are true. Then ask yourself, supposing these premises are true, would it be possible for the conclusion to be false? Supposing these premises are true, could the conclusion be false? If the answer to that question is yes, the argument is invalid. So you ask yourself, okay, I'm going to assume these premises are true for the moment. I'm temporarily assume they're true. Is it possible that the conclusion could be false? If it is possible that the premises would all be true and the conclusion could be false, the argument is invalid. So, trying to figure out if an argument is valid, you ask yourself, okay, I'm going to suppose these premises are true. Could the conclusion be false? If the answer is no, if the conclusion has to be true, under the supposition that the premises are true, then the argument is valid. If you suppose all the premises are true and it is not possible for the conclusion to be false, then the argument is valid. Okay, so again, this concept of validity is super, super important for the whole rest of class, so let's test our understanding. I want you to determine if the following argument is valid. So here's the basic premise. First basic premise, all squares have 4 sides. Basic premise 2, my window frame has 4 sides. Therefore, we infer my window frame is a square. So ask yourself, if all these premises are true, is it possible for the conclusion to be false? I'm temporarily assuming that premise 1 and premise 2 are true. Would it be possible for the conclusion to be false? In this case, this argument is not valid. The conclusion could be false. My window could be a rectangle that is not a square. Even if both the premises were true, the conclusion could be false. So this argument, not valid. Let's go again. Testing your understanding. Determine if this argument is valid. If God is all-knowing, then He knows everything I will ever do in the future. If God knows everything I will ever do in the future, then my future is already determined. If my future is already determined, then I do not have free will. Therefore, if God is all-knowing, I do not have free will. So you're asking yourself, is this argument valid? We're going to suppose for the moment that all of the basic premises are true. Supposing that all 3 of these premises are true, could the conclusion be false? This argument is valid. If all of these premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. The conclusion follows logically from the premises. If each of those premises were true, the conclusion could not be false. All right, let's do one more. Here we go. Zeus is the god of thunder and lightning. If thunder and lightning exist, then Zeus, the god of thunder and lightning, must exist. Thunder and lightning most certainly exist. Therefore, ergo, fancy philosophy word, Zeus exists. Valid or invalid? What do you think? Supposing all the premises are true, assuming temporarily that they're true, would it be possible for the conclusion to be false? No. If these premises were true, the conclusion would also be true. So this is again a valid argument. Okay. Let's try again. Testing our understanding. Determine if the following argument is valid. All Americans believe that God exists. Pope Francis is an American. It follows that Pope Francis believes that God exists. Valid or invalid? Again, this argument is valid. The conclusion follows from the premises. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, but, all Americans don't believe in God, and Pope Francis is not an American. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the premises are false. What matters is that if they were true, then the conclusion would necessarily have to be true. Right now, we're just testing for validity. And validity just has to do with the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. All right. Let's keep going. Keep testing our understanding. We're going to switch it up now to true and false. True or false? All valid arguments are sound. True or false? All valid arguments are sound. This is false. All sound arguments are valid, but a valid argument with false premises is not sound. So that was like the previous argument about the Pope. It was valid, but since it had false premises, it was not sound. All right, true or false? All sound arguments are valid. This should be an easy one. I just told you the answer. All sound arguments are valid. True. True, by the definition of soundness, any argument that is not valid is not sound. Another one, true or false? If an argument has all true premises and a true conclusion, it is sound. If an argument has all true premises and a true conclusion, it is a sound argument. False. This statement is false. An argument could have all true premises and a true conclusion and still not be valid. Remember, for sound arguments, you need all true premises and it needs to be valid. So here's an example of an argument that has true premises, a true conclusion, but it's not valid. If Donald Trump is the President of the United States, he must be at least 35 years old. True premise. That is true. Basic premise 2. Donald Trump is at least 35 years old. Again, true premise. Conclusion, Donald Trump is the President of the United States. Again, conclusion is true. So we have two true premises, all true premises, and a true conclusion. But this is not a sound argument. It is not valid. We can imagine a situation in which both premises are true and the conclusion is false. For example, in 2014, both premises were true, but the conclusion was false. Similarly, if he loses the next presidential election, then when the next president takes office, both premises will still be true, but the conclusion will be false. So the fact that it is possible that both premises could be true when the conclusion is false tells us that it's an invalid argument. So, even if an argument has true premises and a true conclusion, it is not necessarily sound. It could still be invalid. All right. Again, a little more true and false to test your understanding just because this concept is so important. If an argument is valid and has all true premises, then the conclusion is true. True or false? If an argument is valid and has all true premises, then the conclusion is true. This is true. It is true by the definition of validity. Remember, according to the definition of validity, an argument is valid when the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of conclusions. So don't be confused. Valid arguments do not have to have true premises. They can be valid even if they have false premises. But if they are valid and the premises are true, then the conclusion will be true. And this is why validity is such an important concept. Because as long as we have true premises, then validity guarantees that the conclusion will be true. That's what validity does. It guarantees that if your premises are true, then your conclusion will be true. It doesn't guarantee that your premises are true, however. All right. Keep going. True or false? If an argument is sound, then the conclusion is true. True or false? True. A sound argument has all true premises and it is valid. According to the definition, an argument is valid when the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So, since sound arguments, by definition, have all true premises and are valid, they must have a true conclusion. Okay, that's the end of our true-false test. If you did not get all of the answers right, make sure that you understand why the answers are what they are. If you don't understand, be sure to ask about it in class. We're going to move on now to the next part of our lesson, which is counterarguments. Counterarguments are a way to demonstrate that an argument is valid. You can use a counterargument to prove that somebody else's argument is invalid. Again, creating a counterargument is a way to demonstrate that an argument is invalid. To create a counterargument, you are going to present a possible scenario in which all the premises of the original argument are true. You add some additional detail and show that the conclusion of the original argument is false. So again, when you want to criticize an argument and prove that it is invalid, that the premises do not imply the conclusion, or that the conclusion does not follow from the premises, you can create a counterargument. When you create a counterargument, you present a possible situation in which all of the premises of the original argument are true, but you add some additional detail which makes it turn out that the conclusion of the original argument is false. Now I want to point out that the scenario only has to be a possible scenario. It doesn't have to be an actual scenario. And what this counterargument does is show that it's possible for all of the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. And according to the definition of validity, if it's possible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, it's not valid. Okay. And now I'm going to give you an example. So suppose we have this argument. The world contains horrendous suffering. No moral human with the power to prevent such suffering would allow it to exist. If God exists, God would have the power to prevent horrendous suffering. Therefore, God does not exist. So supposing somebody gave you this argument, how could you show that it was invalid? You could use a counterargument. In your counterargument, you include all of the original basic premises. You accept the basic premises as true. So my counterargument contains all the same basic premises. But then I add an additional detail. So here's my additional detail. God is both powerful and immoral. So I agree with all your basic premises. The world contains horrendous suffering. No moral human being with the power to prevent that suffering would allow it to exist. And if God exists, he would have the power to prevent horrendous suffering. But I add this detail, but God is both powerful and immoral. So therefore, God exists, but just doesn't care that there is horrendous suffering. So notice about the counterexample, it has the same first three basic premises as the original argument. So we're accepting all those premises as true, but we're adding this additional detail. God is both powerful and immoral, and this additional detail allows us to derive a conclusion which is the opposite of the conclusion from the original argument. So the counterargument is showing that even if all of the original premises were true, it is still possible that the original conclusion could be false, and if that's the case, the argument is not valid. So this is one very powerful way of critiquing arguments, providing a counterexample. A point to note, though, just because you can't produce a counterexample does not imply that an argument is valid. So producing a counterexample, a true counterexample, does prove that the argument is invalid. But a failure to produce a counterexample does not prove that the argument is valid. It might prove that you just can't think of a counterexample right at the moment. Maybe you're just not very imaginative at the moment or something. So, while counterexamples can prove that arguments are invalid, failure to produce a counterexample does not count as proof that the argument is valid. We're going to learn in most of the rest of the logic lessons ways to prove arguments are valid. Counterexamples can prove that they're not valid. You'll have to wait until future lessons to learn how to prove that an argument is valid. Okay, that's the end of the lesson, so just keep in mind, here's the things that you should know by now. The difference between valid and true, the definition of soundness, that has all true premises and it's valid. You should know and understand the precise definition of validity. The precise definition of validity is that if all the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. Make sure you understand it. Don't just memorize it. If you don't understand it fully, ask questions about that definition in class, because everything in the rest of the class is going to be built on that definition of validity. Finally, you should understand counterarguments. You should understand how to use counterarguments to demonstrate validity. You should know how to create a counterargument, and you should be able to explain why or how that counterargument demonstrates that an argument is invalid. If you can do these things, you're in good shape.